The morning mist clung to the windows of Millbrook Elementary like ghostly fingers, obscuring the view of the playground, where children's laughter once echoed through crisp October air. Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface as she stared at the empty swings that hadn't moved in 27 years. Not since that Tuesday morning when her daughter Amy walked through these very doors with her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. Her dark hair pulled back in the ponytail Sarah had braided with trembling fingers just hours before the world changed forever. The hallways of the abandoned school stretched before her like a mausoleum of memories, each classroom door a silent testament to the inexplicable tragedy that had consumed not just her daughter, but 23 other third graders and their beloved teacher, Mrs. Henderson. Room 3B remained exactly as it had been found that fateful afternoon. Desks arranged in perfect rows, papers still scattered across surfaces, pencils lying where they'd been dropped mid-sentence, as if time itself had simply stopped at 2:15 p.m. on October 15, 1997. The official investigation had yielded nothing but questions that multiplied like shadows at dusk. Security cameras showed the children entering the building that morning, their small forms captured in grainy black and white footage that now lived in evidence boxes, gathering dust in some forgotten storage facility. But the cameras had malfunctioned during the crucial afternoon hours, leaving only silence where answers should have been. No signs of struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. Just an empty classroom where 24 souls had vanished, as completely as if they'd never existed at all. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, please consider subscribing. Sarah had returned to this place countless times over the decades, drawn by a mother's desperate hope that somehow, somewhere within these walls, she might find the clue that everyone else had missed. The FBI had packed up their equipment after 18 months of fruitless investigation. The local police had reclassified the case as cold after 5 years of dead ends. Even the private investigators she'd hired with her life savings had eventually thrown up their hands in defeat, their final reports reading like exercises in futility. But a mother's heart doesn't accept defeat. It beats with the rhythm of hope long after logic has abandoned the fight, and Sarah's heart had been beating that desperate rhythm for 27 years. She'd memorized every inch of this classroom, every scuff mark on the linoleum floor, every crayon drawing that still clung to the bulletin boards like prayers written in primary colors. Amy's desk, third row, second seat, remained exactly as her daughter had left it, with her name card still taped to the upper right corner in Mrs. Henderson's careful handwriting. The autumn light, filtering through the grimy windows, cast long shadows across the room, and Sarah found herself studying the space with eyes that had grown sharper with age and desperation. She'd learned to notice things that others overlooked, to see patterns where others saw only chaos. It was a skill born of necessity, honed by years of searching for meaning in the meaningless, hope in the hopeless. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, or the way the silence seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break through the wall of mystery that had held firm for nearly 3 decades. Sarah moved between the desks with practiced ease, her fingers trailing across surfaces that had once been warm with the energy of children's dreams and laughter. The classroom walls were adorned with the detritus of interrupted education, a half-finished alphabet chart, a weather calendar frozen on that fateful Tuesday, math problems worked out in childish handwriting that would never know completion. Each artifact was a reminder of lives cut short, futures stolen, families shattered by the incomprehensible weight of not knowing. Sarah paused at the teacher's desk, where Mrs. Henderson's coffee mug still sat beside a stack of graded papers. The beloved educator had been 42 years old, a woman who dedicated her life to nurturing young minds and fostering the kind of wonder that makes children believe in magic. If anyone could have protected those kids, it would have been Eleanor Henderson, with her warm smile and fierce devotion to her students. The fact that she'd vanished alongside them only deepened the mystery, adding another layer of impossibility to an already inconceivable crime. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting the room in the golden light that photographers call magic hour. It was in this light that Sarah noticed something she'd never seen before, a subtle discoloration in the wood grain of Mrs. Henderson's desk, barely visible unless viewed from precisely the right angle. Her heart began to race as she bent closer, her trained eye, sharpened by decades of desperate searching, detecting what might be nothing more than a water stain or coffee ring. But something about the mark called to her, whispering secrets in a language only a mother's heart could understand. Sarah's fingers trembled as she traced the faint mark on Mrs. Henderson's desk, her pulse quickening with the familiar surge of hope that had sustained her through countless false leads and bitter disappointments. The discoloration was roughly circular, about the size of a coffee mug bottom, but there was something deliberate about its placement, too perfect, too intentional to be accidental. She retrieved the small LED flashlight from her purse, a tool she'd carried for years during her visits to the abandoned school. The concentrated beam revealed details invisible to the naked eye, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The mark wasn't just a stain, it was carved into the wood, shallow but unmistakable, forming a pattern that looked almost like coordinates. The numbers were tiny, etched with what must have been a sharp instrument, possibly a compass point or a geometric tool. Sarah's hands shook as she copied them into her notebook. 42. 3,601 degrees north 71. 0589 degree W. Her mind raced through the possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Mrs. Henderson had been known for her attention to detail, her methodical approach to everything she did. Could she have somehow left this message, this breadcrumb, for someone to find? Sarah pulled out her smartphone, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the screen as she entered the coordinates into a mapping application. The result made her legs weak. The coordinates pointed to a location in Boston, Massachusetts, approximately 2 hours northeast of Millbrook. But not just any location. They marked a spot in the heart of the city's warehouse district, an area known for its abandoned industrial buildings and forgotten corners where secrets could hide for decades. The rational part of her mind warned against hope. She'd followed so many leads over the years, each one seeming promising at first, only to crumble under the weight of reality. The coordinates could be anything. A coincidence, a mark left by investigators, even something as mundane as furniture placement from years before the disappearance. But the desperate mother in her, the part that had never stopped believing her daughter was alive somewhere, clung to this discovery like a lifeline. Sarah photographed the mark from multiple angles, documenting every detail with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned the hard way that evidence could disappear as mysteriously as children. She'd seen too many potential clues dismissed or overlooked by overworked officials who'd long since moved on to cases with better prospects for resolution. As she worked, her mind drifted back to that terrible October day when her world had shattered. She remembered the phone call from the school secretary, the trembling voice explaining that Amy's class was missing, that no one could find them anywhere in the building. The initial assumption had been a field trip mix-up, perhaps a scheduling error that would be resolved with a few phone calls. But as the hours stretched into evening, and then into the dark of night, the truth had become undeniable. 24 people had vanished without a trace. The investigation that followed had been the most extensive in the county's history. FBI agents had swarmed the school, treating every surface as a potential crime scene, every detail as a possible clue. They'd interviewed everyone: parents, staff members, delivery drivers, even the crossing guard who worked the intersection outside the school. Ground-penetrating radar had been used to search beneath the building, cadaver dogs had combed through miles of surrounding forest, and volunteers had formed search parties that covered every inch of the town and beyond. Sarah had been at the center of it all, her maternal instincts refusing to accept the growing consensus that her daughter was gone forever. She'd pushed investigators to consider every possibility, no matter how far-fetched. Kidnapping by a coordinated group, some kind of mass hypnosis, even the possibility of underground tunnels or hidden rooms within the school itself. Each theory had been explored and ultimately discarded, leaving behind only questions and the echo of children's voices that would never be heard again. The media attention had been intense but short-lived. For a few months, the story of the vanishing classroom had captured national headlines, spawning documentaries, conspiracy theories, and a brief surge of amateur detectives who thought they could succeed where professionals had failed. But as the months turned to years without answers, public interest had waned, leaving the families to grieve in a silence broken only by the anniversary vigils that grew smaller each year. Sarah had never missed one of those vigils, even when she was the only person who showed up. She'd stand in the school parking lot with her candle and her photographs, speaking Amy's name into the darkness and refusing to let the world forget that her daughter had existed, had mattered, had been loved beyond measure. Now, staring at the coordinates she'd discovered, Sarah felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down upon her. She could share this information with the cold case detective who occasionally returned her calls, but experience had taught her that official channels moved slowly, if at all. She could hire another private investigator, but her resources were limited after decades of searching. Or she could do what her heart was already telling her to do, drive to Boston herself, and see what waited at those coordinates. The sun had nearly set, painting the empty classroom in shades of amber and shadow. Sarah gathered her things, with the methodical care of someone who'd learned to treasure every potential clue, no matter how small. As she prepared to leave, she took one last look around the room that had haunted her dreams for 27 years. "I'm still looking for you, baby," she whispered to the silence, her words carrying the weight of a mother's unwavering love. "I'll never stop looking." The coordinates felt like a promise burning in her pocket as she walked through the empty hallways toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the darkness like a heartbeat that refused to give up hope. The drive to Boston took Sarah through the heart of New England's autumn landscape, trees ablaze with colors that reminded her of Amy's crayon drawings, the same vibrant reds and golds her daughter had used to color the leaves in her last art project, still hanging on the refrigerator at home after all these years. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter as memories threatened to overwhelm her focus, forcing herself to concentrate on the GPS coordinates that had led her to this moment of desperate hope. The warehouse district emerged from Boston's urban sprawl like a forgotten world, its brick buildings standing sentinel over empty streets marked by decades of industrial decline. Sarah's small sedan looked out of place among the delivery trucks and commercial vehicles that rumbled past, their drivers paying no attention to the middle-aged woman who sat parked at the coordinates she'd discovered, staring at a seemingly unremarkable building that might hold the answers she'd sought for nearly 3 decades. The structure before her was typical of the area, red brick darkened by age and weather, windows either boarded up or so grimy they revealed nothing of the interior beyond. A faded sign near the entrance read, "Cornerstone Storage Solutions," though the business appeared to have been closed for years. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete loading dock, and rust stained the metal fire escape that zigzagged up the building's eastern wall. Sarah's hands trembled as she consulted her phone, double-checking the coordinates. This was definitely the place Mrs. Henderson had somehow marked in her desk. But why? What possible connection could this abandoned warehouse have to a classroom of missing children in a small Massachusetts town 2 hours away? She sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching for any signs of life, any indication that this place might still serve some purpose. The street was quiet except for the distant rumble of traffic from the main thoroughfares, and the only movement came from a stray cat that picked its way carefully through the debris scattered across the vacant lot next door. Finally, Sarah's desperation overcame her caution. She'd driven this far on nothing but hope and a pattern carved into a wooden desk. She couldn't turn back now without at least trying to understand what had brought her here. The car door slammed behind her with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, and her footsteps echoed off the brick walls as she approached the building's main entrance. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock, but years of weather had taken their toll on the building's integrity. Sarah walked the perimeter, testing windows and looking for any way inside that wouldn't require breaking the law. It was on the building's north side, hidden from the street by an overgrown hedge, that she found what she was looking for, a basement window with a broken latch, its frame warped enough to allow entry for someone determined enough to squeeze through. The descent into darkness required every ounce of courage Sarah had accumulated over 27 years of searching. The basement smelled of mildew and motor oil, with an underlying odor she couldn't identify, but that made her stomach clench with unease. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a maze of concrete support pillars and abandoned equipment that cast grotesque shadows on the walls. It was the sound that stopped her in her tracks, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Not the settling of an old structure or the scurrying of rodents, but something rhythmic, purposeful. Something that sounded almost like breathing. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed the sound, her flashlight beam dancing across the concrete floor. The basement was larger than she'd expected, extending far beyond what the building's exterior had suggested. As she moved deeper into the darkness, she began to notice details that didn't belong in an abandoned warehouse. Electrical conduits that looked relatively new, ventilation ducts that hummed with quiet efficiency, and floors that were too clean for a building that had supposedly been empty for years. The sound grew stronger as she approached a heavy metal door set into the basement's rear wall. Unlike everything else in the building, this door showed signs of regular maintenance. The hinges were oiled, the lock mechanism appeared functional, and there was a small electronic keypad mounted beside it that glowed with a soft red light. Sarah pressed her ear to the metal surface and immediately pulled back in shock. The breathing sound was coming from the other side of the door, but it wasn't just one person. It was multiple people, breathing in the slow, rhythmic pattern of deep sleep or sedation. Her mind reeled with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Could it be possible that after all these years, after all the false leads and dead ends, she had actually found them? Could her daughter and the other children be alive, somewhere beyond this door, kept in some nightmare scenario that defied understanding? The keypad demanded a numeric code, but Sarah's fingers hovered over the numbers as desperation warred with logic. Any wrong entry might trigger an alarm, alerting whoever was responsible for this place to her presence. But the sound of breathing on the other side of the door called to every maternal instinct she possessed, drowning out the voice of caution that had kept her safe through decades of searching. She thought of Mrs. Henderson's careful nature, her attention to detail, her love for her students. If the teacher had somehow left those coordinates as a message, perhaps she'd left other clues as well. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember everything she could about Room 3B, about the woman who'd dedicated her life to education and who'd vanished alongside her students. Then it came to her, October 15th, 1997, the date of the disappearance. Sarah's fingers moved across the keypad with growing confidence. October 15th, 97. The lock disengaged with a soft click that seemed to echo through the darkness like a gunshot. The door swung open to reveal a corridor lined with soft lighting, its walls painted in colors that seemed both familiar and impossible. Sarah stepped through the threshold and found herself face to face with a sight that defied every assumption she'd made about her daughter's fate. The hallway stretched before her exactly like the corridor of Millbrook Elementary, complete with children's artwork on the walls and the same institutional carpet she remembered from that October morning 27 years ago. But these weren't just reproductions. They were exact duplicates, down to the smallest detail, as if someone had transplanted an entire section of the school into this underground facility. Sarah's legs nearly gave out as she recognized Amy's artwork hanging on the wall, a finger-painted autumn tree with leaves in shades of orange and red, signed in her daughter's careful 7-year-old handwriting. But that was impossible. The original had been destroyed along with everything else in Room 3B when the school was demolished 5 years after the disappearance. Yet here it hung, perfectly preserved alongside drawings from Tommy Martinez, Jessica Wu, and all the other children who had vanished that October day. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before her, lit by the same fluorescent fixtures that had hummed above the hallways of Millbrook Elementary. Sarah's flashlight trembled in her grip as she moved forward, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. Each step brought new revelations that challenged everything she thought she knew about her daughter's disappearance. Classroom doors lined the hallway, their small windows revealing glimpses of the spaces beyond. Sarah pressed her face to the first door's glass and nearly collapsed at what she saw inside. It was Room 3B, recreated in perfect detail down to the weather calendar still displaying October 15th, 1997, and the half-finished math lesson still written on the whiteboard in Mrs. Henderson's distinctive handwriting. But the desks weren't empty. Seated at their assigned places were the children. Older now, their faces bearing the lines of years that had passed in this underground world, but unmistakably the same kids who had walked into that classroom 27 years ago. Amy sat in the third row, second seat, her dark hair now streaked with premature gray, her small frame grown into that of a 34-year-old woman. Yet she wore the same clothes she'd had on that October morning, somehow preserved and maintained across the decades. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as she watched her daughter mechanically work on a math problem, her movements slow and deliberate, as if operating under some kind of influence or control. Around the room, the other children, now adults, performed similar tasks with the same eerily synchronized precision. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the class, her auburn hair now completely white, but her posture and demeanor exactly as Sarah remembered from parent-teacher conferences so many years ago. The door handle turned easily under Sarah's desperate grip, and she burst into the classroom with tears streaming down her face. "Amy!" she cried, rushing toward her daughter's desk. "Oh God, Amy, I've been looking for you. I never stopped looking." But Amy didn't respond. She continued working on her arithmetic as if Sarah weren't there, her pencil moving across the paper in careful, measured strokes. Sarah grabbed her daughter's shoulders, shaking her gently, then more urgently when she failed to get any reaction. Amy's skin was warm, her breathing steady, but her eyes remained fixed on her work, with a glassy, unfocused stare that spoke of something far worse than physical captivity. "What have they done to you?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to face Mrs. Henderson. The teacher looked up from her lesson plan with the same vacant expression, acknowledging Sarah's presence, but showing no sign of recognition or surprise. "We're working on double-digit subtraction today," Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that sounded exactly as Sarah remembered, yet somehow hollow, emptied of the warmth and enthusiasm that had made her such a beloved educator. "The children are making excellent progress. Amy is particularly gifted with numbers." Sarah backed away from the desk, horror creeping up her spine like ice water. These weren't the same people who had vanished 27 years ago. They were shells, husks, animated by some terrible process that had preserved their bodies while stealing their souls. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her daughter was alive, but the Amy she had known and loved was gone, replaced by this strange automaton that wore her face but had lost everything that made her human. "Who did this?" Sarah demanded, her voice echoing off the classroom walls. "Who's responsible for this nightmare?" Mrs. Henderson continued, as if Sarah hadn't spoken, directing the class through their lesson with the mechanical precision of a wind-up toy. The children, these adult prisoners trapped in their childhood roles, responded with the same eerie synchronization, raising their hands at predetermined moments, reciting answers in unison, moving through the day's schedule with the mindless efficiency of a program running on automatic. Sarah stumbled from the classroom and down the hallway, peering into other rooms that revealed more impossible scenes. A gymnasium where children played eternal games of kickball, their movements repetitive and joyless. A library where they sat reading the same books over and over, turning pages at precisely timed intervals. A cafeteria where they consumed meals that materialized from nowhere, eating without taste or pleasure or awareness of what they were doing. Each room was a perfect recreation of Millbrook Elementary, but twisted into something nightmarish, a monument to childhood innocence corrupted and trapped in amber. Sarah began to understand that this wasn't just kidnapping. It was something far more sinister, a violation of human nature itself that had turned 24 precious souls into living dolls, acting out an endless performance for an audience she had yet to meet. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized she was no longer alone in this underground purgatory. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, wearing a perfectly pressed suit that might have been stylish 27 years ago, but now looked like a costume from another era. "Welcome, Mrs. Chen," the man said, his voice cultured and calm, as if her presence here was expected, even planned for. "I've been wondering when you would find us. Your persistence has been quite remarkable, though I must admit I'm impressed it took you this long to decode Eleanor's message." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she faced the architect of this horror, the puppet master who had orchestrated the theft of her daughter's life and the lives of 23 other innocent souls. "Who are you?" she whispered, though part of her already suspected the answer would be more terrible than anything she could imagine. The man smiled with the cold precision of a scientist discussing a particularly interesting specimen. "My name is Dr. Marcus Whitmore, and you, Mrs. Chen, are about to become part of the most important educational experiment in human history." Dr. Marcus Whitmore's office occupied the end of the corridor, and stepping into it was like entering a twisted version of an elementary school principal's workspace. The walls were lined with photographs, not of graduation ceremonies or proud achievement moments, but surveillance images capturing 27 years of artificial childhood in this underground prison. Sarah's stomach lurched as she recognized Amy in dozens of photos, documenting her daughter's transformation from a 7-year-old girl into the hollow-eyed woman she'd just encountered. "Please, sit down," Whitmore said, gesturing to a chair positioned precisely in front of his mahogany desk. His movements were deliberate and controlled, like everything else in this nightmare facility. "I imagine you have questions, and I find that understanding helps people adjust to their new circumstances." Sarah remained standing, her entire body coiled with the fury of a mother whose child has been stolen and tortured. "You're insane," she spat. 27 years of keeping children prisoner, turning them into whatever those things are in those classrooms. What kind of monster does that? Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his eyes gleamed with the fervor of someone who believed completely in his own twisted logic. "Monster? Mrs. Chen, I've preserved something beautiful that the world was determined to destroy. Do you know what happens to childhood innocence in the real world? It dies. It's murdered by bullies, by academic pressure, by the cruel realities of growing up. These children have been spared all of that." He stood and moved to a wall covered with charts and graphs, data tracking decades of behavioral patterns and psychological measurements. "The modern education system is a failure," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. "Children are processed through like products on an assembly line, their natural curiosity crushed, their creativity stifled. But here, in this controlled environment, they exist in a state of pure learning, untainted by the corruption of the outside world." Sarah's hands shook with rage as she stared at this madman who spoke of her daughter's imprisonment as if it were a gift. "They're not learning anything. They're like robots doing the same things over and over. You've destroyed their minds." "I've perfected their minds," Whitmore corrected, his tone remaining infuriatingly calm. "Through a combination of pharmaceutical intervention and behavioral conditioning, I've created the ideal educational environment. No distractions, no negative influences, no fear of failure. They exist in a constant state of receptive learning, absorbing knowledge without the emotional baggage that normally interferes with education." The photographs on the wall told a different story, images of children growing older while trapped in an eternal first day of school, their faces gradually losing expression and life as the years passed. Sarah could see Amy in photo after photo, watching her daughter's smile fade and her eyes grow vacant as Whitmore's treatments stripped away everything that made her human. "Mrs. Henderson tried to stop you," Sarah realized, the pieces finally falling into place. "She carved those coordinates into her desk before you took them. She was trying to leave a trail." Whitmore's smile faltered for the first time since she'd arrived. Eleanor was resistant to the process initially. She had some antiquated notions about educational freedom and emotional development, but even she came to understand the beauty of what we were accomplishing here. The children were happier without the stress of real-world pressures. "Happier?" Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. "They're not happy. They're not anything. You've turned my daughter into a zombie." "Your daughter is safe," Whitmore replied, moving to another section of the wall where detailed medical charts tracked each child's physical and mental state over the decades. "She's healthy, she's learning, and she's protected from all the pain and disappointment that would have defined her adult life. In the outside world, she might have faced divorce, career failures, the death of loved ones. Here, she knows only the joy of eternal childhood." Sarah's mind reeled as she began to understand the full scope of Whitmore's delusions. This wasn't just about kidnapping children. It was about playing God, deciding that his vision of protection was worth more than human freedom and growth. "You had help," she said, thinking of the elaborate facility, the decades of maintenance, the resources required to keep this nightmare operational. "Of course," Whitmore acknowledged. "There are others who understand the vision, educators, researchers, benefactors, who believe in the importance of preserving innocence. This facility is just one of several experiments in perfected learning environments. We've made tremendous advances in educational psychology." The casual way he mentioned other facilities made Sarah's blood run cold. How many children had disappeared over the years, taken by people who believed Whitmore's twisted philosophy? How many families had lived with the same anguish she'd endured, never knowing their children were trapped in underground schools designed to steal their humanity? "I want to see Amy again," Sarah demanded. "I want to talk to her." "She won't respond," Whitmore warned. "The conditioning prevents unnecessary emotional disturbance. But you're welcome to observe. In fact, I think you'll find it quite peaceful to see her in such a content state." He led her back down the corridor to room 3B, where the macabre lesson continued exactly as she'd left it. Amy sat at her desk, still working on the same math problems, her movements mechanical and precise. Sarah knelt beside the desk and took her daughter's hand, desperately searching for any sign of recognition, any spark of the little girl who used to run to her arms at the end of each school day. "Amy, it's Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've been looking for you for so long. I never gave up. I never stopped believing you were alive." For just a moment, Amy's pencil paused in its movement across the paper. Her head turned slightly toward Sarah's voice, and something flickered behind her vacant eyes. A ghost of memory. A whisper of the person she had once been. But then Whitmore stepped forward, and Amy's attention snapped back to her work as if Sarah were nothing more than a momentary distraction. "You see?" Whitmore said softly. "She's at peace. No anxiety, no fear, no confusion about her purpose in life. She knows exactly what she's supposed to do, and she does it perfectly every day." Sarah stood slowly, her grief transforming into something harder and more dangerous. She turned to face Whitmore with the expression of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "You're wrong," she said quietly, "and I'm going to make sure the world knows what you've done here." Whitmore's smile returned, cold and confident. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mrs. Chen. You see, there's a reason I allowed you to find this place. Your persistence has been noted by my colleagues, and we've decided that you would benefit from the same peaceful existence we've provided for your daughter. Welcome to your new classroom." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow as armed guards emerged from concealed positions throughout the facility, their weapons trained on her with professional precision. Whitmore had never intended to let her leave. Her arrival had been anticipated, planned for, perhaps even orchestrated. The coordinates she'd discovered weren't a cry for help from Mrs. Henderson, but bait in a trap that had taken her 27 years to spring. "You expected me to find those coordinates," Sarah said, her mind racing through the implications. "This was all planned." Whitmore nodded approvingly, like a teacher pleased with the student's deduction. Eleanor's message was modified to serve our purposes. "We've been monitoring your activities for years, Mrs. Chen. Your dedication to finding Amy was touching, but also problematic. You've come dangerously close to exposing our work on several occasions." The guards closed in around her, their movements coordinated with military precision. Sarah's eyes darted toward the corridor, calculating distances, looking for any possible escape route. But even as her survival instincts kicked in, another part of her mind was focused on a different kind of calculation: the layout of the facility, the number of guards, the security measures she'd observed. "The conditioning process will be much easier for you than it was for the children," Whitmore continued, opening a medical case that contained syringes filled with an opalescent liquid. "Adult minds are more resistant to behavioral modification, but we've refined our techniques considerably over the years. Within a few months, you'll find the same piece that Amy has discovered." Sarah's hand moved slowly toward her purse, her fingers closing around the small device she'd carried for years. Not the LED flashlight, but something far more important. A GPS tracker and emergency beacon, military-grade equipment she'd purchased after too many late-night investigations in dangerous locations. One press of the button would send her location and a distress signal to emergency services, along with a pre-programmed message that would bring law enforcement to this hidden facility. "Before you begin your treatment," Whitmore said, preparing the syringe with practiced efficiency, "you should know that Amy has been asking about you. Not consciously, of course. The conditioning prevents such emotional disturbances, but in her dreams, she sometimes calls for her mother. Soon, you'll be able to comfort her directly." The guards were close now, but Sarah had learned patience during her decades of searching. She waited until the precise moment when their attention was focused on Whitmore's preparations, then triggered the beacon and dove toward the classroom door. The facility erupted in chaos as alarms began blaring. But Sarah was already moving, her desperate mother's strength carrying her through the maze of corridors faster than she'd moved in years. Behind her, she could hear shouting, the sound of running feet, the crackle of radio communications as Whitmore's people tried to coordinate their response to her escape. She burst into different classrooms as she ran, hoping against hope that seeing their parents might break through the conditioning that held the children prisoner. In each room, she shouted names, grabbed shoulders, tried desperately to trigger some spark of recognition that might shatter the artificial peace Whitmore had imposed on them. "Tommy Martinez! Jessica Wu! Michael Chang!" she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Your family's never stopped looking for you. Your parents love you. Remember who you are." For a moment, she thought she saw something in Jessica's eyes, a flicker of confusion, a crack in the perfect composure that marked all of Whitmore's victims. But then the guards caught up with her, and the moment was lost in the struggle as they dragged her from the classroom. Whitmore waited in the corridor, his earlier composure replaced by cold fury. "You've disrupted weeks of conditioning with your interference," he snarled, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of benevolent educator. "The children were achieving perfect stability, and now they'll require additional treatment to restore their equilibrium." "Good," Sarah gasped, her arms pinned behind her back but her spirit unbroken. "I hope I've ruined everything you've built here." "You've only delayed the inevitable," Whitmore replied, signaling for the guards to hold her while he prepared another syringe. "But perhaps that's for the best. Your resistance will provide valuable data for our research into adult conditioning protocols." The needle was approaching her arm when the first explosion shook the facility, sending dust cascading from the ceiling and causing the lights to flicker ominously. Sarah's beacon had done more than summon help. It had alerted federal authorities who'd been tracking similar disappearances for years, law enforcement agencies that had been waiting for any clue that might lead them to children who'd vanished from schools across the country. Whitmore's face went pale as the sounds of tactical teams breaching the facility echoed through the corridors. "Impossible," he whispered. "The security measures, 27 years of searching, taught me to be prepared," Sarah said, feeling hope surge through her for the first time since she'd entered this nightmare. "I may have walked into your trap, but I brought backup." The guards were torn between their duties as the facility's defenses began to collapse around them. Some maintained their positions, while others rushed toward the breach points to confront the incoming federal agents. In the confusion, Sarah felt their grip on her arms loosen as they struggled to process Whitmore's conflicting orders. Another explosion rocked the facility, closer this time, and suddenly the corridor filled with smoke and the sound of heavy boots on concrete. Federal agents in tactical gear poured through the breach points, their movements swift and professional as they secured each section of the underground complex. Sarah had never been so grateful to see the bold yellow letters FBI stenciled across body armor. "Federal agents! Everyone on the ground! Now!" The commanding voice cut through the chaos like a knife, and Sarah watched with fierce satisfaction as Whitmore's people began surrendering their weapons and dropping to their knees. The doctor himself stood frozen, the syringe still clutched in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief at the collapse of his carefully constructed world. Agent Rebecca Torres, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty, approached Sarah with practiced caution. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Chen? We received your emergency signal." "Yes," Sarah gasped, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline faded and the reality of her situation hit her. "The children, they're all here. 24 children from Millbrook Elementary who disappeared 27 years ago. They're alive, but he's done something to them, something terrible." Agent Torres helped Sarah to her feet while simultaneously coordinating with her team through her radio. "We need medical personnel down here immediately. Multiple victims, possible chemical or pharmaceutical intervention. And I want every inch of this place documented before anyone moves anything." Whitmore finally found his voice as agents restrained him. "You don't understand what you're destroying," he protested, his earlier composure completely shattered. "These children have achieved perfect educational equilibrium. Years of research, millions of dollars in development." "Shut up," Torres said flatly, her disgust evident. "Save it for your lawyer. You're going to need a very good one." As the federal team began the delicate process of securing the facility and documenting the evidence, Sarah insisted on accompanying them through each classroom. She needed to see Amy again, to be there when the medical team began their evaluation of what Whitmore had done to her daughter and the other children. Room 3B was crowded with FBI agents and medical personnel when Sarah returned, but she pushed through to Amy's desk, where her daughter still sat, mechanically working on the same math problems, despite the chaos erupting around her. Dr. Martinez, the federal psychologist who'd been called in to assess the victims, was already making preliminary observations. The conditioning appears to be pharmaceutical in nature, combined with intensive behavioral programming. He explained to Sarah in a gentle voice, "We're seeing signs of long-term chemical dependency, but the good news is that most psychiatric interventions are reversible with proper treatment and time." Sarah knelt beside Amy's chair and took her daughter's hand again, feeling the warmth of living flesh that had sustained her hope through nearly 3 decades of searching. "Amy, it's Mom. The bad man can't hurt you anymore. We're going to take you home." This time, Amy's response was different. Her pencil dropped from her fingers, and she turned to look directly at Sarah. For a moment, the vacant expression flickered, and something else looked out through her eyes. Confused, frightened, but unmistakably human. "Mom?" The word was barely a whisper, slurred as if Amy were waking from a deep sleep. What happened to my classroom?" Sarah's tears came in a torrent as she gathered her daughter into her arms for the first time in 27 years. Amy felt fragile, disoriented, like someone emerging from a coma, but she was there, the real Amy, not the hollow automaton that Whitmore had created. Around the room, other children were beginning to show similar signs of awakening as the medical team administered emergency medications to counteract whatever chemicals had kept them in their artificial stupor. "We're going home, baby," Sarah whispered into Amy's hair, which still smelled faintly of the strawberry shampoo she'd used as a child. "We're finally going home." The medical facility in Boston, where Amy and the other victims were taken, looked nothing like the sterile underground prison they'd left behind. Here, natural light streamed through large windows, and the walls were painted in warm, soothing colors that seemed designed to remind people that the real world still existed beyond the nightmare they'd experienced. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the lead psychiatrist overseeing the victims' treatment, explained the complex process of rehabilitation to the families who'd gathered from across the country. Parents who'd aged decades while their children remained frozen in time, brothers and sisters who were now older than the siblings they'd lost, spouses and children who'd never known their missing loved ones, all united by the impossible task of rebuilding relationships that had been severed by Whitmore's madness. The pharmaceutical conditioning was extensive, Dr. Kane told the assembled families during their first group meeting. Dr. Whitmore used a combination of memory suppressants, mood stabilizers, and behavioral modification drugs that essentially put their personalities into a state of suspended animation. The good news is that the core personality structures appear to be intact. The challenging news is that recovery will be a long process, measured in years rather than months. Sarah sat beside Amy's hospital bed, holding her daughter's hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness during the initial detoxification period. The woman lying there bore the physical features of the 7-year-old who'd vanished so long ago, but her body was that of a 34-year-old who'd lived an entire adult life in artificial childhood. Amy's hair had grown during her captivity, her body had matured, but her mind was a confused jumble of memories that didn't align with the passage of time. "I remember Halloween was coming," Amy said during one of her lucid moments, her voice still carrying the cadence of a child, despite coming from an adult throat. "Mrs. Henderson said we were going to have a party. Did I miss it?" Sarah's heart broke a little more with each innocent question, each request for toys and activities that belonged to a 7-year-old's world. How do you explain to someone that they've lost 27 years of their life? How do you help a grown woman understand that the little girl she remembers being is gone forever? "There will be other parties," Sarah said gently, stroking Amy's hair as she'd done so many times in those precious years before the disappearance. "Right now, you just need to rest and get better." The other families were dealing with similar challenges. Tommy Martinez's parents had divorced 10 years after his disappearance, unable to bear the weight of their shared grief. Now they sat on opposite sides of his hospital room, trying to navigate not only their son's recovery, but their own complicated emotions toward each other. Jessica Wu's younger brother had become a police detective, driven by his sister's disappearance to pursue a career in law enforcement. Now he struggled with the surreal experience of being older than the sister he'd spent his life trying to find. Mrs. Henderson's situation was perhaps the most complex of all. At 69 years old, she'd lost more than half her life to Whitmore's experiment. Her husband had remarried after having her declared legally dead, and her own children were now middle-aged strangers who barely remembered the mother who'd vanished when they were teenagers. The teacher's dedication to her students had cost her everything: family, career, the chance to live her own life. "I tried to fight him," Mrs. Henderson told Sarah during one of their conversations in the facility's common room. Her voice was stronger than Amy's, perhaps because her adult mind had been more resistant to the conditioning, but the confusion and grief in her eyes was heartbreaking to witness. "Those first weeks, I tried to protect the children. I tried to find a way to escape or send a message, but the drugs, they made everything so foggy, so hard to think clearly. You did send a message, Sarah reminded her. The coordinates you carved into your desk. That's how I found you all. Mrs. Henderson's brow furrowed as she struggled to remember. Yes, I think I remember doing that. In the beginning, before the treatments made everything feel so peaceful. I thought if someone searched the classroom carefully enough. She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. 27 years. Those beautiful children lost 27 years because I couldn't protect them. You couldn't have known, Sarah said firmly. None of us could have imagined something like this. But you saved them in the end. Your message brought them home. The media attention was intense, but carefully managed by federal authorities who understood the delicate nature of the victims. Recovery. The story of the vanishing classroom had captured the world's imagination decades earlier, and its resolution was front-page news across the globe. Reporters and documentary filmmakers clamored for interviews, but Dr. Kane and her team maintained strict controls on access to protect their patients' privacy. What emerged through official channels was a picture of an extensive criminal network that had operated under the guise of educational research for decades. FBI investigations revealed that Whitmore's facility was one of at least 6 similar operations across the country, all funded by wealthy individuals who believed in his twisted philosophy of preserving childhood innocence through involuntary imprisonment and conditioning. The legal proceedings were complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and dozens of defendants. Whitmore himself faced federal charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity. His calm demeanor during the initial arrest had given way to increasingly erratic behavior as the full scope of his crimes became public knowledge. In custody, he continued to insist that he'd been protecting the children from the corrupting influences of modern society. Agent Torres visited Sarah regularly during Amy's treatment, keeping her updated on the investigation's progress. We've identified over 100 missing children, who we believe were taken by Whitmore's network over the past 40 years, she explained during one visit. Most of the other facilities have been shut down, but some of them didn't survive the conditioning process. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at the implications. How many? Too many, Torres replied quietly. Whitmore's early experiments were even more brutal than what we found at your daughter's facility. He was perfecting his techniques, using children as test subjects. As the weeks passed, Amy began to show more signs of recovery. Her memory was returning in fragments, not in chronological order, but in emotional clusters that reflected the power of certain experiences to transcend even the most sophisticated conditioning. She remembered her first day of school, the taste of her birthday cake, the feeling of safety when Sarah tucked her into bed at night. But she also remembered fragments of her captivity, the endless repetition of lessons, the strange drowsiness that followed certain meals, the gradual fading of her ability to think about anything beyond the artificial classroom environment. These memories were traumatic, but Dr. Kane explained that their return was actually a positive sign that Amy's natural psychological defenses were reasserting themselves. The hardest part for all of them will be accepting the time they've lost, Dr. Kane told Sarah during one of their regular consultations. Amy has the body and life experience of a 34-year-old woman, but the emotional and psychological development of a 7-year-old child. We'll need to help her bridge that gap carefully, at her own pace. Sarah nodded, though part of her wondered if Amy would ever truly recover from what had been done to her. 27 years was more than half a lifetime, more than the entire span of Amy's childhood and young adulthood. How do you give someone back the years that have been stolen from them? But then Amy would smile, or laugh at something she remembered from before the disappearance, and Sarah would see glimpses of the daughter she'd lost and the woman she might become. Recovery was possible. It would be difficult, painful, and incomplete, but it was possible. The most important thing was that they were together again, and no one would ever take that away from them. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the small house she'd bought near the treatment facility, watching Amy attempt to make breakfast, with the concentrated focus of someone relearning the most basic aspects of adult life. At 36, her daughter had made remarkable progress, but recovery from Whitmore's conditioning remained an ongoing process marked by small victories and frustrating setbacks. The pancakes are burning, Amy said with a laugh that held notes of both childlike frustration and adult awareness. I still can't get the timing right. Sarah moved to help, but stopped herself. a lesson learned through months of therapy about allowing Amy the dignity of independence, even when tasks seemed overwhelming. "The smoke alarm hasn't gone off yet, so you're doing better than last week," she said instead, earning a genuine smile from her daughter. The woman Amy was becoming bore little resemblance to the mechanical automaton Sarah had found in that underground classroom. Through intensive therapy, careful medication management, and the patient support of her family, Amy had begun to develop an adult personality that incorporated both her childhood memories and her current experiences. She would never be the person she might have been if Whitmore hadn't stolen her life, but she was becoming someone new, someone uniquely shaped by both trauma and recovery. The legal proceedings had concluded 6 months earlier, with Whitmore receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. His network of co-conspirators faced similar fates, their educational research foundations revealed as fronts for some of the most sophisticated child trafficking operations in modern history. The trials had been painful for the families, forcing them to relive details of their loved ones' captivity, but they'd also provided a sense of closure that many had never expected to achieve. Amy had testified via video conference, her statement brief but powerful. "He stole our childhoods and our chance to grow up normally, but he couldn't steal who we really are inside. We're still here, and we're still fighting to become the people we were meant to be." Mrs. Henderson had made the most remarkable recovery of all the victims, perhaps because her adult mind had been more resistant to the conditioning process. She'd returned to teaching, not in a traditional classroom, but as an advocate for missing children and their families. Her first-hand experience with both victimization and survival made her uniquely qualified to help other families navigate the complex emotions of hope and despair that defined their daily existence. "Sarah's daughter is making real progress," Mrs. Henderson reported during one of their monthly video calls. She'd relocated to California to live near her son, but maintained contact with all the families affected by Whitmore's crimes. "Have you seen the artwork she's been creating? It's quite remarkable. Very sophisticated for someone rediscovering her creative abilities." Amy's art had indeed become a revelation, both to her therapists and to Sarah herself. Using colors and techniques that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her subconscious, Amy created paintings that captured the experience of existing between worlds, childhood and adulthood, memory and reality, trauma and healing. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts had expressed interest in exhibiting some of her work, though Amy wasn't yet ready for that level of public attention. The other survivors were scattered across the country now, each following their own path toward recovery. Tommy Martinez had surprised everyone by pursuing a degree in education, driven by a desire to understand how learning environments could be used to heal rather than harm. Jessica Wu had become an advocate for victims' rights, her unique perspective on long-term captivity making her a powerful voice for legal reform. Some of the survivors struggled more than others. Michael Chen had never fully recovered his ability to form new memories, leaving him trapped in a perpetual state of confusion about time and relationships. 2 others had committed suicide in the months following their rescue, overwhelmed by the impossibility of reclaiming lives that had been so thoroughly stolen. Their deaths served as stark reminders that Whitmore's crimes had caused damage that would ripple through generations. For Sarah, the return of her daughter had brought both joy and unexpected challenges. She'd spent 27 years defining herself as the mother of a missing child, building her entire identity around the search for Amy. Now, with Amy home but forever changed, Sarah had to learn how to be the mother of a trauma survivor, a role for which no parenting book could have prepared her. "I dream about the classroom sometimes," Amy said, as they sat together on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Not the underground one, the real room 3B before everything happened. "Mrs. Henderson is teaching us about fractions, and sunlight is coming through the windows, and everything smells like chalk and those industrial markers she used on the whiteboard." Sarah reached over and took her daughter's hand, marveling, as she always did, at the strange miracle of this second chance they'd been given. "Do you miss it? That feeling of being 7 years old?" Amy considered the question seriously, her face reflecting the deep thoughtfulness that had emerged during her recovery. "Sometimes. But I think I'm starting to like being grown up, even if I'm not very good at it yet. There's so much I want to learn about the world, the real world, not the fake one he kept us in." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. 2 women who'd been separated by unimaginable circumstances, but who'd found their way back to each other across the divide of decades and trauma. Sarah thought about all the milestone moments she'd missed. Amy's first crush, her high school graduation, her college years, the career she might have chosen. Those experiences were gone forever, stolen by a madman's delusions about preserving innocence. But they'd been given something else instead, the chance to build a new relationship based on who they were now rather than who they'd been before the disappearance. Amy would never be the daughter Sarah had lost, but she was becoming the daughter Sarah had found. Scarred but resilient, childlike in some ways but wise in others. A living testament to the human spirit's ability to heal even the deepest wounds. "Mom?" Amy said as they prepared to go inside. "Thank you for never giving up. Dr. Kane told me how hard you searched, how you never stopped believing I was alive somewhere. I know I can't remember most of what happened to us, but I remember that feeling. Even in the deepest parts of the conditioning, I somehow knew you were still looking for me." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she hugged her daughter, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo and marveling at the simple miracle of having Amy in her arms again. "I'll always look for you," she whispered. "No matter where you are or how lost you feel, I'll always find my way back to you." The house settled around them as they headed inside, a home rebuilt from the ashes of tragedy but stronger for having survived the fire. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had remained constant through 27 years of separation and would continue long after their small human drama had played out. But for now, in this moment, mother and daughter were together again, and that was enough. The story of the vanishing classroom had ended not with the dramatic rescue Sarah had once imagined, but with the quiet daily work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by incomprehensible cruelty. It was a harder ending than the fairy tale suggested, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough. As they settled into their evening routine, Amy reading a book that helped her practice adult-level comprehension, while Sarah caught up on emails from the support group she'd founded for families of long-term missing persons. Both women carried with them the knowledge that some wounds never fully heal, but love persists across any distance, through any darkness, for as long as the human heart continues to beat. What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories coming.